For the Formula One World Championship, it's 6 of one or half a dozen of the other. It's round 6 of the World Championship, of course, and where else is Formula One than Miami? And in the heat of Florida, there is one big question that's buzzing through the world of Formula One. Can McLaren catch up with Red Bull? And the orange cars, or should we call them papaya cars, are looking quite different around the Hard Rock Stadium. And to introduce some of the changes that the McLaren team have made for this race, well, Greg Stewart was catching up with Andrea Stella earlier in the pit lane.
Andrea, when I saw the list of upgrades to the car, it's a significant upgrade to the MCL 60, isn't it?
Yes, definitely a significant amount of work that went into delivering these kind of upgrades, which go, yeah, you're right, from front wing to rear wing. Pretty much every part of the car has been subject to some development. Really great effort by the team to make it possible. I think this car actually comes slightly ahead of time compared to what we had planned initially, testament to the efforts that we had at McLaren. It seems to be on the paper a decent step in lap time, but we will see on track. As we know, you do have to achieve correlation between your development tools, say, wind tunnel and simulations, and what actually happens on track.
It was really interesting to hear Andrea talking about the correlation that the team have to go through. And for those who don't know it, I've talked about it before, correlation is a term you often hear Formula One engineers talking about. And that's using all of the different development tools that the teams have at their disposal. The wind tunnel, CFD, which is the virtual wind tunnel, on-track testing and the big aero rakes and things you see like that, and the dye you chuck all over the back of the car to see what the airflow's doing. Getting them all to match up and say the same piece of information, and that driver feedback as well. If you get them all to work exactly in harmony, that's good correlation. Get them all to say something different, that's poor correlation. And that's what McLaren really need to do with their new wind tunnel finally on stream. But let's take a look at some of those new parts in detail that are on the McLaren this weekend. The new engine cover is pretty distinctive, quite a lot of changes in this part of the car, but I'm going to rattle through some of these details in a bit more detail. And the one thing I love talking about are the brake ducts on the car, and I've talked about this many times, and McLaren like playing around with them. Gone are the days where McLaren struggle to get their front brakes cool. That doesn't seem to be a problem anymore. And once again, the scoop section on the McLaren is pretty familiar. They've had that sort of shape for most of the season. Refined the internals, refined the outlet. But actually what I wanted to take a bit of a closer look at, something we don't really get to have a good look at on a regular basis. It's the rear brake ducts. And this is something you can really see quite clearly here on the rear end of the McLaren. And you can see the inner plate, that's pretty much of a muchness. They've run that for quite a little while. But you can see all of these beautiful little aerodynamic details along these sticky-inny bits, or out towards the tirey bits, I guess you have to call them. And then the actual duct itself, where all of that cooling air goes into the brake disc and the brake caliper. Now, these parts are clearly not just about cooling the brakes. There's clearly a big aerodynamic advantage to some of these parts like this. And you can see the sculpting on some of those parts very clearly. And actually, if you have a look at this part here, you can see it's a wing shape, but it's directing that airflow downwards. What it does inside that duct and inside the interface of the rear wheel, hard to say, but this is a really complex and really exciting area of aerodynamic development. So much more advanced than we sort of expected when the 2022 regulations were introduced. 2 years on, the teams are really going crazy. And look at some of the beautiful sculpting around these rear suspension elements. Well, that's something else the team have been playing around with, trying to get the most out of that rear aerodynamic package and the way the air's flowing around the back of the car. Take a look from above, you can see some of those aerodynamic elements on the rear cooling section. It's not cooling at all, is it, when you look at that? That's a winglet. That's designed to boost the downforce, boost the efficiency of the car around the circuit. And that's something that's really exciting to see. Then looking at the same part from the rear, because we talked about the air coming into the rear brakes, well, that's coming in up here, but it's always worth thinking what goes in must come out. And here you see the back of the cooling duct, and you can see from the colour of that material, that light grey, this is a 3D printed component the team have finished off. It's rapid prototyped, it's developed very quickly, and this is something the team will continue to develop all the way through the season. Let's not forget, Miami is a very hot circuit. With a big long straight though, it should be quite good, easy to cool the brakes around some parts of the circuit. When you get to other circuits later in the year, like Canada, let's take a look and see what they do in that part of the car. Now, you thought I'd missed it, didn't you? No, I didn't. Look, here is the new side pod duct on the McLaren. This is their big development item for this race, and it's got tongues wagging and eyes looking as well. Now, you can see the side pod duct, it hasn't moved, it hasn't changed location. We haven't got a Red Bull style slit duct, but have a look at the winglet that sits underneath the rear view mirror on the car. That's got slightly larger, and it's looking quite familiar to me. Now, if you compare it to what McLaren started the season with, here you can see the duct on the side of the car. There is that aerodynamic element underneath the rear view mirror. But if I bring the car through the corner a little bit, I love this clip because I use it so often, and this angle is great. We'll be using it all season long, of course. You can see the very large side pod duct. It's much bigger than it is on the car in Miami. They've reduced the size of that side pod duct quite significantly. Now, when you look at that shape there, you can see that actually the area here, the actual height of the side pod duct has changed quite a lot. It's got quite a lot smaller. When you see a team changing the height and the size of the side pod duct, what you don't see is all the gubbins under here, all of the radiators and all of the coolers and stuff that are underneath the side pod, and quite a lot of them up here in the top of the car. They all have to be completely re-engineered, completely changed. And what teams have realised is, while there is an aerodynamic testing allowance, each team is limited on how much wind tunnel and CFD time they can use. When you're changing some of these coolers, some of these cooling system parts on the inside of the car, that doesn't come out of your allowance at all. It's just all the other stuff around it that you can see here, that does come out of your aerodynamic testing allowance. But the actual coolers, you can muck about all day long developing new coolers, as long as the cost cap allows it. So that's what McLaren have been doing. Let's see if it works out on track. The other thing to take a look at is, of course, this shape here. Look, let's have a look at the overall shape of that side pod and that almost overbite style inlet. You've got that much smaller inlet than we've seen in previous races. It looks familiar. Why does it look familiar? Well, there's the Red Bull. McLaren are still following that Red Bull development path. While they haven't gone quite as wild with all the holes in the ecclesiastical layout of the Red Bull, with all those wholly different solutions and all those different inlets and exits, the McLaren is following that overall shape of the Red Bull, and I think you're going to see a bit more of that as the season goes on. Then as we get round to the floor of the car, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because the complete floor of the car is all new. I could point to all the little elements. It's absolutely beautifully sculpted here, and I love these elements here. I call them the viaduct section sometimes, but just look at that. That's not engineering, that's pure artistry, and you'll see that stuff like that up and down the pit lane, but it is wonderful to see that. Looking at the car from the rear, you can see a massively revised engine cover, all of those little cooling louvers, all those cooling outlets, everything optimized to get the most out of the rear wing, the rear cooling package. It's hot in Miami, so we've talked a little bit about that. But let's move down to the rear of the car, and you can see something missing. In previous races, McLaren have had a twin beam wing layout, and you can see that is missing from this part of the car. That upper element is not needed on this circuit layout. They've only gone for a single layout. There it is. That rear suspension, of course, has been revised as well. And you can see that section, single section, reduces drag, reduces downforce. So with all of those parts on the car, will it all work? Well, free practice one was inconclusive, but a man who's got a good idea was also talking to Greg Stewart. It's Andrea Stella again.
A long list of changes. Could you just talk us through some of the individual items on the car and what you're hoping to achieve with them?
Overall, what you're trying to achieve is to increase the aerodynamic efficiency of the car. We have a new front wing, which goes with some adjustments to the front brake duct and suspension, then floor and body work, and then at the back of the car also the rear brake duct has been updated. So overall, like I say, just trying to get more downforce without adding drag, and also try to improve the interaction between the car and the tyres.
And that is the key word to everything, aerodynamic efficiency. Andrea Stella actually nailed the explanation of that without even asking the question. What is aerodynamic efficiency? In very simple terms, getting as much downforce as possible without getting the drag, aerodynamic drag that comes with it. If you can get a load of downforce without any drag, That's a very efficient package. Now, if McLaren can get that right, then they are going to be a bit of a weapon around this circuit. How much of a weapon? And the big question that we asked at the top of this show, can McLaren catch Red Bull? What does Andrea Stella think?
We saw the upgrade you brought to Austria 2023, and that brought you much closer to Red Bull, who are setting the pace currently. Is this equivalent to a Spec B car, and also do you feel like it could help you take the fight to Red Bull and get ahead of Ferrari definitively?
There are some elements of what you could call a B-spec car in that in order to accommodate these aerodynamic changes, we needed to make some changes under the bodywork to the mechanical side, radiator layout, and so on. So there's definitely quite a lot of work on design, which is not simply of an aerodynamic nature. But the change, the upgrades we took to Austria last year, they were slightly bigger in terms of expected performance. So this is a considerable amount of work. But in terms of performance outcome, we don't expect such a turnaround like we had in Austria last year. I think to get to Red Bull, we'll have to deliver a few more of the steps that we have taken here to Miami.
Of course, McLaren is not the only team in Miami with a major upgrade package. In fact, an awful lot of new bits on the Aston Martin, at least in the FIA's official documentation. The problem is, when we looked at the car in free practice 1 and in the pit lane before free practice 1, not all of those new bits were fitted to the car. So I think we're going to take a bit more of a close look at the Aston Martin and how that's being developed a little bit later in the season. So instead of that, I'm going to stick with the same company that makes the power units in the back of the Aston Martin. I am talking, of course, of Mercedes. And of course, as we're in Miami and the heat is on, well, Mercedes have increased their cooling package. And you can see that very, very clearly here. They've opened up all of their cooling louvres pretty clearly. Not much more scope to introduce a few more louvres. They'd have to change a panel quite significantly to introduce some more here. Maybe space for just one more in there. And then they've opened up the louvres in the gully as well. We've seen them do that a few times. You can actually see here, though, there is a bit more scope on that panel to introduce some more of those cooling slats along the top of the bodywork. So they might do that at some of those high temperature circuits like Mexico, where it's high altitude and they need all the cooling they can get, or some of the low speed, high temperature circuits, Hungaroring, later in the year. So keep an eye there if they keep that side pod shape, and we don't know if they're going to. But discussing all of that cooling goodness, Andrew Shovlin was talking to Greg in the pit lane.
Well, I mean, this is the hottest we've run the car so far. It's quite difficult for the ERS system here, where you've got the sort of sequences of slow corners and not a lot of air going through the car. It's really just some subtle changes to the arrangement of louvers on the car to give us a bit more headroom if it is hot, and it looks like we're going to be close to 30 degrees in the race on Sunday. But as you're implying, just to get a bit more air flowing through the radiators to take a bit more temperature out of it. But everyone's going to be in a similar boat. They're all going to have to be opening up their cars.
Of course, it's not just the cooling slats that are new on the Mercedes in Miami. The team have introduced quite a significant upgrade to the floor. Here you can see the leading edge of the floor. They've been playing around with some of these elements. I always think this bit here is particularly interesting, and the shape of it is a little bit different to that other teams use. And when you start getting into how these floors look at the front, what you're not seeing is all the clever stuff that's going on underneath. Now, that's something that the teams don't really let us look at unless a driver has a bit of a boo-boo out on track, and then we all look at it. Neither Mercedes' driver has done that yet, but maybe we'll see that later in the season. Who knows? I mean, George did flip the car in Australia, but it wasn't the clearest look at the floor. Now, the section of the floor I want to talk about is here, and you can see it really clearly. This section here, it's so aggressive. Will Buxton talked about this in the live coverage, how impressed he was with it. We didn't get to get a good look at it, but before I get into too much detail about that, I think we need to talk to the man who introduced it. Once again, Andrew Shovlin.
Andrew, what are we looking at here? What have we got?
Well, the main thing we've changed is the floor. So that's really a complete redesign. We've been working on that in the tunnel for the last couple of months, and it's the first significant change we've made to this car. It's part of a development set that was destined originally for Imola, so we've tried to pull that forward. So everyone at the factory has done a great job to try and get 2 sets of that on the cars here for the sprint race weekend. There is a bit more to come in the next few races, but it's really just to try and improve the base performance of the car, hopefully close the gap to a few of those teams ahead of us. And we'll see how it works in FP1. There isn't long to understand it and then implement that learning ahead of qualifying. But certainly, we're very grateful to have the parts here.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating stuff there from Shove, and this section of floor, I think it's beautiful. It's quite different to what anybody else is using in the pit lane. It's a lot more vertical. I like to call this section the viaduct section because it looks like something a train might drive over. But actually on most other cars, it's a slightly different shape. And I think Mercedes are beginning to find their feet with this car and trying to move it forwards. Will it be enough to stay at the front? I think probably yes, but will they get right to the front? Still a lot more work to do. But Mercedes are a team you can never discount. There's one of their front wings, and that's always interesting for everybody with some innovation in that. And I just wonder, is Mercedes on the cusp of bringing something really special? Well, as we've been talking about all of the Mercedes-powered cars in this issue of Tech Talk, it would be wrong not to mention Williams. Williams bought a new front wing. You can see that on your screen now. We're going to take a bit more of a detailed look at the Williams in a future episode, as we will, of course, with the Aston Martin. But I think for now, there is just so much going on up and down the pit lane. There's a lot of action in South Florida. So we're going to be enjoying that through the rest of the weekend. And there's so much more to catch up on. So keep an eye on us here on Tech Talk. We've got a lot more to come.